Thank you. Hi. So welcome, everybody. Can people hear me? Somebody waved to check they can hear me. Look at that. And I've had a quick scroll down through your pictures and images. How lovely to see so many friends and colleagues, friends all and colleagues from around the country. Nick slightly understated it by saying this is the biggest launch event we've ever had for a report. And the last time the college hosted a launch, there were about 25 people there. There are apparently over 200 people registered for today's event, so we're delighted by that, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to try to summarise some of the results of this year's report for us today. Not all the results, and I'm actually going to do that across both presentations in a way that I hope is helpful for you. So if you only want to find out about mortality, nurse staffing, and breast milk feeding, come back for the second presentation, but hopefully they'll both be of interest. So in this first thing, I'm going to try to signpost you to NNAP Online, which Jess might be able to tell us, I'm hoping is now live. Jess is muted, but she might be able to tell us whether it's actually live.
It should be live.
Fantastic.
And I did ask for that, so I'll check that and make sure it is.
So those of you who've got two screens could be looking at your own results at the same time. I know that's the way you all work. I'm hoping also that we can enlist your help in reviewing the key findings and delivering the recommendations to the target groups. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off. I know that we all know that NNAP is not just about very preterm infants, the babies are less than 32 weeks, but those babies are represented here at the top. And we aim to discharge those babies home alive and to find them unimpaired at 2 years of age with no difficulties. But between those two outcomes, there's the sad possibility that some of the babies will die, and some things represented in red ellipses. Bad things that can happen: infection, NEC, BPD, formula feeding, brain injury. And we've got some things, some blue ellipses: antenatal steroids, magnesium, deferred cord clamping, being delivered in the right place, the right temperature, interventions, and most importantly, having enough nurses to allow to get the best outcome for these babies and look after the families in the meantime. So I'm going to kick straight into some of those measures. We all know that NNAP have got a measure about whether a mother who delivers a baby between 23 and 33 weeks gestation, does she get at least one dose of antenatal steroids? And broadly speaking, the answer to that question is yes. About 92% of eligible babies received a dose, mothers received a dose of antenatal steroids. And here we see a caterpillar plot. So on the vertical axis, we've got the proportion of women who received a dose of antenatal steroids whose babies were admitted. And along the horizontal axis, we've got the Neonatal Networks represented. And you can see that the London Northwest Neonatal Network do very well at this. And there's a little bit of spread between neonatal networks. The light grey spots, so here, for example, in the northern region, with a measure of uncertainty around that spot, that's 2018 rate, and in 2019, significant improvement, and many networks show important improvement in this. So I think this is really encouraging. This is assurance. This is showing the system that we're using antenatal steroids in a widespread and effective way. So we convene, or the college convenes groups to decide what this data means, to decide on the key findings, and to make recommendations based on those key findings. I want to try and point some of these out to you. These are very much thought through and considered and come from a very multidisciplinary group. Recommendations made include that neonatal units and obstetric service, the perinatal team, should optimize the timing and dosing of antenatal steroids whilst avoiding inappropriate use of multiple courses. And adopt the following evidence-based strategies to predict preterm birth. So the BAPM, perinatal optimization, which JC is going to talk about, and SPSP, Scottish Patient Safety Programme. The group were also keen to recommend that National Maternity and Perinatal Audit could consider developing other reporting of antenatal steroid use in order to encourage timely administration to eligible mothers. So antenatal magnesium sulfate after precept, we all know, we perhaps all knew before, that antenatal magnesium sulfate reduces the chances of babies being born below 30 weeks, certainly, and some more mature infants, of developing cerebral palsy when they're older. So the question hidden by your video for me is a mother who delivers a baby below 30 weeks gestation age given magnesium sulfate in 24 hours prior to delivery? And the answer is that we're doing significantly better at this. So here we see a caterpillar plot, again, vertical axis 0 to 100%, and the individual neonatal units represented along the bottom. And you can see there's and the neonatal intensive care units, which tend to be larger and so have smaller confidence intervals than local neonatal units in blue and special care units in grey. You can see that all kinds of units have all kinds of performance at this, but in general, we're approaching, on aggregate, the developmental standard, which was arbitrarily set at 95%. It's really impressive when you look at the neonatal networks and how they've changed over time. For example, let's take London Northwest on the right-hand side of the plot. Even London Northwest, who were already very good in 2018, have made a significant shift. And on average, across the country, we've improved by more than 10%, which is pretty exciting. So we're doing really, really well. There's a bit of variation between neonatal networks. Some neonatal networks seem to be able to manage on aggregate more than 90%, and other neonatal networks not quite so good. We take this as supportive evidence that England have done better than Scotland and Wales, and that might be indicative evidence of precept's effectiveness, because that precept didn't run in Scotland and Wales. But really encouraging how well we've done, and we hope this will be sustained during this challenging year of 2020. So I'm going to skip over that. And as you'd expect, we've made some recommendations that neonatal units obstetric service should work as a perinatal team to ensure that women are offered magnesium sulfate where that's possible, and to adopt appropriate guidance and methodologies to drive quality improvement where that's appropriate. So we know too that the least mature babies benefit from being delivered in services where there's an on-site neonatal intensive care unit. And so we have a measure for that in the National Neonatal Audit Programme. And this caterpillar plot shows us for each individual neonatal network, the proportion of babies of less than 27 weeks who are delivered in a hospital with an on-site NICU. The two neonatal networks on the right-hand side, I think, would probably acknowledge that their structures make it much easier for them to meet this standard. And there's a lack of clarity about whether their structures are configured optimally. I know Scotland are proposing to have less neonatal care units in the future. But you can see this wide variation between neonatal networks, and not much improvement from 74% in 2018 to 77% in 2019. So the key findings and then the recommendations, which I thought was actually really quite disappointing. And people felt really quite strongly that this was something that needed to be addressed. So some fairly strong recommendations were made, targeted at departments of health in England, Scotland, and Wales, and that those departments of health and the neonatal network should prioritize structural changes in operational management to ensure that babies who need intensive care are delivered in the right places. And further, and this was quite striking, but clearly based on experience of the professionals who made these recommendations, that local maternity systems and their equivalent bodies in developed nations should ensure that appropriate clinical pathways exist. And by that, they meant, are we clear in every neonatal unit in the country that isn't an intensive care unit, how less mature babies should be antenatally transferred, how that's facilitated. So the clear pathways exist. So we could talk about temperature. Everybody who's been involved with NNAP for any time knows that we're keen to measure the temperature of the babies, and it was the first of BAPM's quality improvement toolkits. The measure is, does an admitted baby born at less than 32 weeks gestation have a first temperature on admission, which is both between 36.5 and 37.5, and measured within an hour of birth? And the answer is that we're, on aggregate, pretty good at this. So here's a caterpillar plot on the vertical axis, 0 to 100%. On aggregate, we manage this nearly 3/4 of the time, 70% of the time. But look at the variation between units. If we just do an apples to apples comparison, comparing the neonatal intensive care unit on the left, manage that less than half of the time, and neonatal intensive care units that can manage it almost, well, over 90% of the time. So very impressive. Neonatal networks too, really interestingly, vary astonishingly with respect to this, from 60 to 80%. Thames Valley and Wessex have got a long history of being excellent at keeping their babies warm. It's striking that some neonatal networks have really improved between 18 and 19 in this highly objective measure. And this shows that we can make stuff better if we try hard. So for example, East Midlands, Southwest Neonatal Network, to some extent my own neonatal network, and others have really improved their thermoregulation. Did I mention East Midlands? I meant to. We can make things better, and we think this is 3% better than last year. We think this is still a best in the world figure. So we do really well at this as a country, but we can still improve further. You can see over the years, this is an apples to apples comparison. We're continually improving by about 3% a year. And importantly, the proportion of babies with a temperature of less than 36 has declined from about almost 1 in 10 to more like 1 in 30. So very exciting. We should be encouraged by what we've done. You don't just need to look after the baby well. In order to look after the baby well, you have to look after the parents well, and that involves making them partners in care. So we have this long-standing measure of, is there a documented consultation with parents, between the parents and a senior member of the neonatal team within 24 hours of a baby's admission? And it's any admission. The answer is, well, mostly yes. We manage this on aggregate, on average, about 19 times out of 20. And you can see that neonatal units of all levels are good and bad at this. So there are neonatal intensive care units that can manage this 100% of the time, and there are neonatal intensive care units that don't do nearly so well at this. And one of the things about this is that if you do averagely well and don't improve, then you get overtaken by the pack. Ask me how I know. Neonatal networks vary significantly. Thames Valley and Wessex, again, excellent at this. But you can see here from the number of neonatal networks that differ between their grey spot and their black spot, how many neonatal networks have really improved and helped drive the standard upwards, and potentially leaving people who are failing to do continuous improvement a little bit behind. There were 5 neonatal networks with the lowest performing in 2018, and 4 out of those 5 have managed a really significant improvement. So that tells us that we can get better in large groups and improve things. So recommendations, the units are urged to reflect on their rates of parental consultation. That they think it's a problem. I think we can own in my own unit that it is a problem. And then to use a QI approach and consider using alternative means such as video calls when parents are not able to enter the neonatal unit for any reason. And this is all about parental partnership in care, of course. So not finally. On-time screening for retinopathy of prematurity. We know this prevents blindness. The audit question being, does an admitted baby weighing less than 1,501 grams or less than 32 weeks gestation undergo their first ROP screen in accordance with the NNAP interpretation of the current guideline recommendations? And the answer is kind of, 19 times out of 20. It's frankly surprising, almost shocking to it is shocking to our parent representatives that we can't just get this right. And significant frustration was expressed in the guideline groups about, in the key findings and recommendation groups about this. Why is it that we can't just sort this out? It's got to be said uncomfortably that there's a neonatal network that is a low outlier for this and has been a low outlier before and a year before that. But there is no network that manages 100% of the time. And it's worth saying that the units at unit level that can manage this 100% of the time, that proportion is getting wider and wider. There are more and more units that can do it 100% of the time. Most of there are 1% of babies, so 1 in 100 babies, are never screened at all. There's no evidence they were ever screened. And of those never screened babies, 10 were less than 30 weeks gestation, so at risk of life-changing disease. Of the babies who weren't screened, they're mostly in neonatal intensive care units. So there was a view, perhaps this is because of poor ophthalmologist availability in smaller neonatal units. That isn't the case. So there's stuff that we can do to address this, and it's not all about data quality. So some fairly strong recommendations made, and in fact, these were not as strong as in the first draft. We think intensive care units in particular have got a responsibility to have a system to identify and treat and screen their babies, and safety systems to make sure that those work. And that neonatal networks have got a role in actually having neonatal networks with low rates of IRP screening should have a mechanism for real-time measurements of their units' adherence to IRP screening guidelines, so that something can be done about it. Because there are a couple of networks in particular where it's clearly an issue. So bloodstream infection and central and associated bloodstream infection are two things we've been measuring for a little while in NNAP with increasing success. So the audit questions that I would draw your attention to: does an admitted baby have one or more episodes of bloodstream infection characterized by a positive blood culture after 72 hours of age? And we have a central line associated bloodstream infection as well. The interpretation of this data is complicated because of the necessary changes in methodology. So the denominator is just slightly different, concentrating on babies who are present at 72 hours of age or afterwards. And we've improved and clarified the list of what constitutes a clearly pathogenic organism. So we would all accept that a Staph aureus or an E. coli or an Enterobacter cloacae species, that they were clearly pathogenic organisms. And we've defined a list of organisms which is available in the report. So the other challenge to this measure is that in measuring infection is only a valid thing to do if a unit can confirm that all its positive blood cultures have been submitted to the audit. And this year, just less than 2/3, 63% of the neonatal units participating in the audit confirmed that all their positive blood cultures. That's a little bit worse than 2018, for which I think we reasonably blame COVID, which was just kicking off at the time. However, if you look at unit level data, it's really quite concerning. For example, amongst the neonatal intensive care units with complete data entry, between 0 and almost 13% of babies less than 32 weeks experience one or more positive blood cultures with a clearly pathogenic organism. This is not likely to be explained by case mix. This represents real variation in quality. And I know neonatal units are taking this seriously already, but I think there's more that we can do as a community. I'm going to skip over the CLABSI findings and take to the recommendations. So it's suggested that we do more than suggest, we recommend that neonatal units with higher reported rates of infection should compare their practices to units that have got lower rates of infection identified by NNAP Online, and ensure that their use of evidence-based infection reduction strategies is optimized. We also thought that neonatal networks and units with both low and high rates had a responsibility to facilitate invitations, to facilitate that cross-fertilization of knowledge between units, so that visits, whether real or virtual, could take place, so that people understand the differences in practice and implement potentially better practices. These visits clearly need to be multidisciplinary because this is a multidisciplinary problem. So, a further important complication of prematurity, bronchopulmonary dysplasia. We define that as oxygen dependency at 36 weeks gestation. And the rates of BPD, perhaps unsurprisingly, vary very strikingly between neonatal units. This is neonatal units of birth. You can see they vary from around 10% to around 60%. And the logical response to this, correctly from neonatal unit colleagues, was this is because of the kind of babies that we look after. And for reasons that some of you will be familiar with, because it's not the first year we've done it. We've done some case mix adjustment, what is in effect case mix adjustment, to try to understand why this occurs, why there's such variation. And the bottom line, and so I'll just further make the point that the pink units, which are the neonatal intensive care units, tend to be on the right-hand side of this plot, so tend to have higher rates of BPD. And of course, neonatal intensive care units look after higher risk babies of less than 32 weeks. So that explains some of the difference. But we've conducted what we call a treatment effect analysis. So what this does is ask, based on characteristics that we record in Badger, how it would be that for a given unit or network, how the babies in that unit or network would have got on if they were looked after in the wider population. And the difference between the calculated rate of that, how those babies would have got on it in the wider population or in the unit, becomes the treatment effect. So in effect, on the left-hand side of the plot, there are units with a negative treatment effect. And that means that babies looked after in those units appear to be significantly favored and have a lower rate of BPD. And that doesn't just include some local neonatal units, includes some in neonatal intensive care units. There are in fact 8 units with low outlying treatment effect for BPD. On the right-hand side of the plot, more concerningly, just as interestingly, there are 16 neonatal units with high outlying treatment effects, suggesting that being looked after in that neonatal unit is more likely to result in a baby being diagnosed with BPD. So this is pretty powerful stuff. It's not so new. We have identified outliers statistically, but not published them. We'll willingly discuss that more with people. This is the same thing for neonatal networks. And isn't it fascinating that it varies by neonatal network to a very large degree? So the raw rate of BPD varies from around 32.5% to well over 40%. And there's a striking variation between networks. We can do the same treatment effect analysis, showing that being looked after in some neonatal networks is associated with an increased risk of death or BPD. It's a combined analysis of death or BPD. And there are some neonatal networks where that looks to be, there's importantly less negative treatment effect. So we hope this is useful information. There are some recommendations that go with this. Neonatal units with high treatment effect should clearly be seeking to identify potentially better practices from neonatal units with lower treatment effect, with low treatment effect. And neonatal units and networks should seek to understand the extent to which care practices do explain the variation and implement any potentially better care practices, including those from the NICE guidance on specialist respiratory care. BAPM is a charitable body, but the participants thought it was reasonable that the BAPM would consider developing a care pathway, identifying potentially better practices that might impact on BPD. And so I imagine BAPM will consider that. So I'm getting there through the outcomes. Nectarizing enterocolitis. This is a terrifyingly bad outcome of very preterm birth. The question being, does an admitted baby born at less than 32 weeks gestation age meet the NNAP surveillance definition for nectarizing enterocolitis on one or more occasions? And the answer is about 1 in 20 babies were diagnosed with NEC according to this definition. There's more to do here. About, just under 2/3, 64% of neonatal units confirmed their NAC data were validated. That's just slightly less than happened in 2018 and is, again, probably a consequence of the COVID epidemic. But even despite that, rates of NEC do appear to vary between neonatal networks by as much as 2-fold. Now, this might be because of some missing data, as high as 13% in one network, but it's not likely to be wholly explained by case mix. Our key findings group pointed out excellently that when neonatal networks think about their NEC rates, they should consider them alongside their mortality rates, because it appears that rates of NEC are lower in networks where mortality is higher. I think this is a quality journey in progress. We've got more to do to deliver high quality data. Just over 5,000 out of the 7,500 eligible babies were in, and most of the NICUs, but not all of them, validated their NEC data. The missing data is well down. So in general, more to do, but we're getting there. So some recommendations. I'm going to skip over those for now, because it's time I got off, I'm sure. Follow up at 2 years of age. In order for us to describe, to deliver what we all want to, healthy babies and discharge from follow-up at 2 years, we need to actually know whether they are healthy babies. And there is, as we all know, a national standard, and in fact, nice guidance describing what we should do for follow-up. And yet we can't be confident that we are doing it. Yes. Does the audit question being, does a baby of less than 30 weeks gestation get medical follow-up at 2 years gestationally corrected age or not? And the answer is not really. So in the blue columns, you can see on the slide over some years, any information recorded at follow-up, we're not doing great as a community with respect to this. We can do better. We have the developmental standard set for some reason at 90%. It's a developmental standard. Perhaps that's our excuse, but really we should all be aiming to do this 100% of the time, which is what we would do if it was our own child or our own colleague's child. Neonatal units vary greatly in their delivery of this. There are a small band of pioneers on the right-hand side of the plot who deliver follow-up to 100% of their babies. And it's noteworthy that that includes units of all types. It's not just special care units. It's not just local neonatal units. It includes neonatal intensive care units. And then on the other side of the plot, there are neonatal networks, neonatal units of all types, special care units, intensive care units, local neonatal units, who deliver follow-up to a much lower proportion of their babies. And that's not really great. If we look at the caterpillar plot, we can see that some neonatal networks have made important improvements in this. I'll big up Yorkshire and Humber because that's where I work. Although, Nick, I am a reformed Londoner. There's one neonatal network where there's been an important drop in the recorded follow-up information. So I think we know as a community that we can do better at this. And we're going to continue to get pressure from our commissioners about this. So there are some detailed recommendations based on NICE guidance. We need to consider the arrangements for communicating with families about follow-up when we discharge them, make plans for families who live a long way away from the hospital, deal with the families who don't attend appointments and families who move, and completing and documenting the assessments. We've got a new partner in this, the British Association for Neonatal Neurodevelopmental Follow-up, BANFU, and we hope that they will describe and promote best practice and successful models of delivery of high rates of follow-up with appropriate instruments. Because I think there definitely are examples of us being shown ways to do this better. So I'll conclude my presentation by encouraging you to look at your unit level results on NNAP Online, which is now live. We hope you'll use the results that you find on NNAP Online in writing your unit quality improvement plan. And we hope that the key findings and recommendations will be helpful to you and other people in the system. I very much hope that you'll share the publication of the report amongst your colleagues, and it's great to see such a multidisciplinary audience here today. And I have got some more results for you later on, but I'm sure that you've had enough for me. So I'm going to stop at this point, and hopefully JC will be there and ready to give us her talk. She's stopped being a photograph. She's become a moving image. She's ready to slide share.